And so they're able to generate some yield from that, and they use that yield to then go and buy Bitcoin. And so ultimately what these companies are realizing is, I want to get capital. If I get capital, I want to convert it to the hardest form of money. And so that means that I want Bitcoin. And so whether it is coming from your product and service driving profits, whether it is from issuing equity, whether it is issuing debt, whether it is issuing some sort of options and covered call strategy, or some other novel thing that people haven't even thought about yet. If you get capital, buy Bitcoin. That's these companies' strategy, and it seems to be working very, very well so far.
So when you're talking to investors who are trying to decide, how can I gain exposure to Bitcoin? Why would they pick a company like MicroStrategy, which is the company buying Bitcoin, as opposed to just getting their own Bitcoin?
Well, I think there's pros and cons, right? On one hand, if you go and you buy Bitcoin, what you're getting is you're getting the return of Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin goes up 20%, you get 20% return. The promise of MicroStrategy is if you buy MicroStrategy, you're going to basically get a levered bet on it. There's also the idea of Bitcoin yield. So if your 10 shares are equivalent to holding one Bitcoin on the balance sheet, he's going to continue to buy Bitcoin in a way that's going to be accretive. So your 10 shares in the future may be worth 1.2 Bitcoin on the balance sheet. So there's this idea of this yield that is generated. That's the positive story. And so far that's played out. That's why people are excited, and they're, kind of going full on with that excitement to allocate to the stock. One of the questions is, will that premium close? And so the numbers as of earlier this week was he had about $30 billion of Bitcoin on the balance sheet, and the company was trading at an $85 billion market cap. If you have 30 billion of Bitcoin, 85, I'm not a mathematician. That's a pretty big gap, about a $55 billion gap. And now he's got his other business. That business isn't really worth that much, and on the grand scheme of things. But let's just give him credit and say it's worth $1 billion. Probably not, but let's say it is. That means there's a $54 billion premium that's being placed on this company's assets. And so why are investors giving it that premium? Well, they believe Bitcoin's going to go up. They believe he's going to buy more Bitcoin in the future. And so they're basically giving him credit for future appreciation and future Bitcoin yield. Makes sense. Companies do that all the time. Investors say, hey, I'm going to look at what is your 2025 revenue. I'm going to put a multiple on that. And so this idea of kind of looking into the future and trying to understand what is it valued today based on those expectations is not a new concept. The question is, are they going to be right? And so on one hand, they could be underestimating it. Maybe there's more Bitcoin yield than they thought, and actually the price of Bitcoin goes much higher than they thought. And so whatever the value is today would be undervaluing that future growth. On the other hand, though, they could be overestimating it. In that situation, that premium is going to collapse. And therefore, if you're buying MicroStrategy at that level and the premium collapses, then you're not keeping up with the appreciation of the Bitcoin. And so when I look at that, I say to myself, well, what most people are probably going to do is they're going to do both. They're going to buy a little bit of Bitcoin. They're going to buy a little bit of MicroStrategy. Maybe they might buy a little bit of the ETF, right? And maybe they go and they buy something else. I tend to think most people are not going to make highly concentrated 100% bets by allocating to this. Instead, they kind of say to themselves, well, I know I want Bitcoin. Maybe I even want to take some Bitcoin into self-custody. Maybe I'll kind of make sure I have that exposure directly to the asset. But this MicroStrategy thing is interesting, or this similar scientific thing, or this MetaPlanet thing, or this DeFi technologies, or all these companies that have Bitcoin on their balance sheet. I might put, 5% into this thing. And I think that's really where people are trying to figure out, what is the right allocation. And there's plenty of people debating it on Twitter. I don't have the answers, but it definitely seems to be working so far.